Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities have endured yet another terrible night and morning. Drones, rockets, everything was raining down on the heads of Ukrainians and their children. In reality, Russia is terrorizing cities across the country, especially in the east and south. And Moscow's appetite doesn't stop there. Russian forces are systematically provoking NATO airspace, and many nations bordering Russia are preparing for the possibility that Putin might strike. The only question is when. Caolan Robertson is an Irish journalist covering the war in Ukraine. He has already become a voice of truth for millions who see and hear his reports. Caolan, I'm so happy to see you here again, safe and sound, after your trip to Kherson.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and thanks for having me back on the show.
So, Caolan, just let's start. I think let's begin from your Kherson trip. You just arrived, and I saw a lot of terrible shots you were posting on social media, how the reality is looking there right now. So can you just please describe everything is going on there? It's not your first time you've been in Kherson, how the city has changed.
Well, the city has changed over the years. I was first there after it was liberated, and the threat was the Russians had just retreated south of the river, and they were hitting that city with artillery constantly and missiles constantly. But civilians would sort of hide on the north side of buildings, at least for some protection. And then the second nightmare came, which is these drones that are literally across the entire sky. They can see everyone, they can see everything, and sometimes hundreds of times a day, those drones take off and chase civilian cars, ambulances and buses. And I made countless films about that. And now they're starting to kill farmers. And there's a very, very incredible, very iconic farmer named Alexander who was photographed with his shotgun and drone detector while he was farming his land, literally just getting food from his soil. And he went quite viral on social media for being basically a hero of Kherson. And they purposefully, intentionally killed him with a drone a few weeks ago. And I had reached out to him to do an interview and realized this when I was on the flight to Ireland. So I went back to specifically speak to farmers because, and the Soviets did this with the Holodomor, it's about repressing food, people that feed the nation. And all of these farmers I spoke to, quite close to Baravi, which is a village east of Kherson, have to carry shotguns and drone detectors because the Russians realize that they can't take Kherson, they can't get north of that river anymore. So the point is to try and demoralize everyone, starve out the population. And Kherson it's so unbelievably tragic as well because it's known for its strawberries, its watermelons, its food. Some of the comments I got on social media were from people that said, one day, years ago when I was in Ukraine, we passed through Kherson and I'll never forget the flavors. And that's what Russia is trying to destroy. And it's not just, when we think of Kherson, we think of the drones, we think of what's happening in the city. But the bigger picture is now the very food from the earth is being targeted. But that's what Russia does everywhere it goes. It brings this cloud of evil and darkness, of starvation, of demoralization. And so I made a film interviewing farmers about the dangers they face and farmers that knew Alexander as well and how he motivated them to still keep on going. And they had a choice. They could easily have gone to Mykolaiv, these farmers. They could have gone to Lviv, but they chose to stay because they said, this is our land. We're Chersonians. We shouldn't have to leave. We're never going to leave. And they've just endured nightmares of years of mines that were left behind by the Russians. They've only finally got these mines out of the ground. And now they've got to look up at the sky and worry about drones chasing them. And they're some of the bravest people I've ever met. And their job is to grow new life from the soil while the Russians are trying to create evil.
You're saying that they are bravest people. Actually, just a short note for our viewers that Kherson is the city on the south of Ukraine. And it was occupied by Russians in 2022. And it was occupied for 8 months. And still, people showed a lot of resilience. Then the city was deoccupied by Ukrainian forces, but unfortunately, the left branch of the Kherson Oblast is still under the Russian occupation. So that's why they're just unfortunately, very successfully attacking them every day. So, my next question, I think that about the moment, the one that you posted on Instagram, when you were showing the drone over your head. So what is the rules? Have you posted it?
Yeah, well, I posted it on my story. It'll be part of the documentary as well.
Yeah, that will be part. So what are the rules for the civilians in Kherson in such cases?
Well, you have to look down at the ground for mines that the Russians are dropping from grenades, and you have to look up at the sky for drones. And if you see a drone, there are posters everywhere in cafes and restaurants that say, listen, run, hide. ways to manage it, ways to deal with it, to run inside. But basically, you have to live in constant anxiety, especially if you have children, especially if you're in a car. I mean, I was sitting outside doing an interview in the city centre and a drone went right above and everyone had to look up. Everyone was staring at the sky. Everyone is on edge. And I'll show that clip. It was buzzing right over. And that's because the Russians want to terrorize the city. They want to have everyone in a state of panic. And the civilians went more further north. I was staying right in the city center close to the river, but the civilians went further north for a short period. Now the Russians are using longer length drones. They're using fiber optic drones that can go 20, 30 kilometers. And now what they're doing is a new tactic, which is to try and starve out the city. There's a highway from Mykolaiv to Kherson. That's the main highway into that city. That highway was covered in burning cars up until a few weeks ago, because they've started specifically hitting it, whether you're a grandmother visiting relatives, whether you're a delivery driver bringing watermelons, they are hitting everything on that road. So I took a train to get there because there was only one train in and out. That was the only way to get in. So they're trying to starve out the city, isolate that city, and then they're bombarding it every single day. There is honestly nowhere else like it, I think, even on the planet. It's very different to even in the Donbass, because in the Donbass there are fields of soldiers separating you as a civilian from the Russians. In Kherson, it's a very narrow river and it's meters away. And with that proximity, the Russians just wreak havoc. When I was there on the last night, there were 15 aerial bombs dropped on the city center. Fortunately, not a massive amount of casualties, but I was staying right next to Freedom Square, so the whole building was shaking constantly. And this is what people have to live with every single day because they're so close to the Russians. And as I said, the closer you are to the Russians, the more darkness and evil follows, the more paranoia, anxiety you have to live with. But I mean, civilians walk around staring at the sky, but they refuse to leave. There's a spirit in Kherson it's really incredible and it's extremely inspiring. They could get a bus to Mykolaiv, but they choose to stay because that's their home and they shouldn't have to.
And I think that's the thing that lots of people could not understand about the local people in Kherson and other cities. And you know what, given the fact that these drones carrying cameras, Russians know that they are target usually not a military people.
No, I mean, this is the city center. This is Freedom Square where the drones were above. And there are streets with trees, there are cafes, there are a few restaurants left. That is the only thing that's existing in the city center. The only thing that's, military targets. I'm sure if you really wanted to, you could find them on the outskirts, artillery and things. But in that city, it is a civilian population. And that's what they're hitting. Because the Russian mentality is to demoralize the population. It's not even a military target. It's to try and break people down, break their spirit, and make them live in darkness, break all their windows, so people have to have boarded up windows, destroy their schools, destroy their hospitals, make it so that there's nowhere to go outside and live your life, so that they can finally break and give up to Russia. But what Putin doesn't seem to realize is that when you try and demoralize a population by attacking and bombing it every single day that believes in democracy, which is what Ukrainians do, it only makes them more dedicated to defending their land. It only makes them more stubborn in a lot of ways against Russia. It has the opposite effect. And Putin still doesn't seem to realize that. So
basically Russians deliberately doing the life in Kherson, the life of people in Kherson, unbearable.
They're trying to make it so that it's unlivable, so that it's a place that isn't worth defending. No one else, they're trying to make it so it gets completely emptied out. No one can live there and it's not worth defending and people just give up. But that's not what happens from my experience in Ukraine. People just become more determined every single day to keep on living life. People were sweeping leaves in the streets with flak jackets because their resistance, say if you're an old person, is to keep the streets clean while the Russians are destroying it. And to still go out and try and celebrate just moments of life is a small act of resistance in Kherson. That's why there are still events that happen underground. And that's how people defy Russia. And the people I spoke to put themselves at risk, even by going on camera and saying, I hate Russia, we want to be Ukrainian, this close to the front line. This is how Alexander was killed. But they still said it to me as soon as I turned on that camera. They said, no, I want to say it, and I want to say it in Ukrainian. We hate Russia. We never want to be part of Russia. And what they're doing is evil. And they risk their lives to even tell the camera that because they're just determined. And it's why I go there so often and report from there so often, because as many people as possible need to see that defiance to really understand what's happening. And actually lots of people see it. Hunted in Kherson, right? Is that the name of your documentary? Yeah. So just not a long time ago, you were going to Dublin and you got the award. And I saw the movie twice. And I don't know, it's just so sad and easy to watch at the same time. Maybe because
because of all the package and story and dynamic, of course. So how do you feel about that? I saw a lot of Russians were attacking you after that, no?
Yeah, well, Russians put me on, Russia Today broadcasts me all the time,
Yes.
Russian propagandists. Whenever I tell anything that's truthful
That's a recognition.
about what the Russians are doing, they lose their mind. You know, instead of giving up and not fighting the war, they'd rather, and not fighting and trying to invade other countries, they'd rather silence people that are telling people about it, right? This is why they went after me when I went to Kursk. But the most frustrating thing about Ireland was I feel like I'm going crazy every time I leave Ukraine, because Ukraine is actually the only country really that really understands the Russian threat. They understand what Russia is and geopolitically understand the full situation. This country has been under unbearable attacks since 2014 and then the occupation. And every time I go to Ireland and I went on a radio station, the host said, well, what about the people 20 kilometers away from you who are at the other side of the front line? Don't you have any sympathy for them? I said, what are you talking about? Do you think when I looked up at a drone and saw it about to drop a grenade on my colleagues and I in Kherson, I thought, I wonder what the operator's thinking on the other side. I wonder if he had hopes and dreams to have a family. No, he's a murderer.
He's a murderer.
But that is the mindset of so many media personalities and actually just the general population outside of Ukraine. It's, well, there's two sides to this. What about the Russians? They're going through a lot as well. And that's why I think it's so important to go to these places, to go to the east and south, and to show what people are, facing every day, true terrorism, and what they're fighting for. You know, when 7/7 happened in London, when those buses exploded all across the underground, we called that terrorism, civilians being bombed. They released a poster campaign that said, see it, say it, report it. In Kherson, civilians are bombed every day in the same sort of terrorism. There are posters that say, listen, run, hide. It's the same thing, but we don't look at it in other countries as the terrorism it actually is. We still think there's two sides. And that is where it's so frustrating. And I remember sitting there in this radio station thinking, how are you asking this question? But this is the whole narrative still to this day, that there are somehow two sides. And that's because Russian propaganda is still working. NBC News put Sergei Lavrov on air 1 month ago, and he said, we don't hit civilians. We don't hit civilians in the Donbass. They say the Donbass is Russian. And so we allow this to pollute our televisions and our radios, and then when you go on television, that's why they ask me, oh, what about the other side? They must be having a hard time too.
Caolan, they call it democracy. You know, the balanced views, that's how they call it. You know, we're also, Russian propaganda still working quite well, I would say. It's in another country bordering with Russia, and it's Estonia. Because I saw the documentary you made. I was waiting for it, and to be honest, by the moment you were showing Narva, I was okay. And then, because I've heard the idea, because of some people who were going to the military trainings, who maybe someone who haven't seen the documentary, it's about the military training that was happening in Estonia, and I was surprised, you know, what was. No, actually, as a Ukrainian, I was not surprised what they were telling to you, why they are there, why they are feeling the threat, a real possibility of Putin may strike. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, I was like, and then Narva, and people are completely different. Some people saying, we would rather die than be into Russian captivity, and then, or, you know, seized by Russia. And then other people saying, okay, we don't mind. We don't mind to and don't you think this kind of a thinking will play a trick, a dangerous trick with Estonians somehow? I
think I showed Russian sympathizers in Narva because A, it's the truth and I wanted to include as much as possible, but B, Russia's tactic has not just been polluting countries with misinformation on their televisions and on their airwaves, but also by filling countries with Russians, filming universities, prestigious universities with Russians, and normalizing relationships with Russia. And that's just one of their ways. That they did this in the Donbass, they did this in Georgia, they did this in Moldova. It's by putting Russians in a place and then saying, oh, look, it's Russian. So it's Russians here. That's what happened in Narva. That's why 90% of people there speak Russian. But the majority of Estonians, the majority of people that live in that country, and it's a small country, only 1 million people, are absolutely, unbelievably against Russia because they all were touched by what happened with they were all affected by what happened with the Soviet Union. Every single person has a grandmother or a father or a relative who knew someone that was deported, knew someone that was put in a concentration camp, knew someone that was sent to Siberia. That country was torn apart. Recipes were hidden, just like in Poltava here. Language was deterred. Schools made Russian mandatory. They did the same type of ethnic cleansing and cultural cleansing that they tried to do here in Ukraine during Soviet occupation. And so most people would rather die than have anything to do with Russia. And that's why that country is preparing right now. That's why I showed the Estonian Defence League, because that's a voluntary group. These are everyday civilians who, unpaid, wake up every weekend and spend their time training in exercises, because they would rather give up their free time to learn to do that than have anything to do with Russia. And I think it's very similar to Ukrainians in that spirit, because both shared that same horror during the Soviet occupation. And the Estonians give me a lot of hope, actually.
I was struck by the quote that Estonians often say the only natural disaster worse than anything else is to be seized by Russia. So basically they were saying they don't have any natural disasters except their neighboring country, Russia.
Which was actually a good point. She said, we don't get earthquakes in Estonia,
yes.
We don't have tsunamis, but the one natural disaster is having Russia as our neighbor. And actually, she was right. I mean, that is a disaster.
It's Ukrainian, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And talking about that, civilians that were going to trainings, because some of our last video shots on Instagram, lots of people were arguing, and those who from Estonia, that it's not going to happen. Russia will not attack. Well, that's quite familiar for me as a Ukrainian to think that Russia will not attack, and and after that, you showed just civilians, not a military men, farmers, teachers, who were just IT men, who went to the front line, to the trainings, because somehow the danger is in the air. So I'm just quite surprised that people are saying that this is not true when just regular people are preparing. That means something.
They can feel it. They know what Russia's capable of. And the same people that say Russia would never take Estonia are the same people that said in February, Russia's not going to go into Ukraine. Russia's not going to do that. That's ridiculous. George Galloway, people like this, they're exactly the same people. But they don't know what it's like to have Russia as their neighbors, right? They don't know how that is. That's why the Estonians are preparing. I think Russia, if they can, will do that.
And, I was thinking about the Russian propaganda, that they are spending millions, years, decades on their propaganda. Don't you think that Ukraine are not spending enough money, resources to counter-propaganda?
It's impossible. What Russia is putting out, Russia only exports terrorism and lies. That's what I've always said. And they are the world's best at propaganda. And it's not millions, it's billions that they're putting in.
Billions, yes.
And countering it is basically impossible. And Ukraine doesn't have to put out propaganda, because Ukraine isn't lying. Ukraine isn't hiding anything. People just have to come here and see the truth. And a lot of people do. That's why so many Americans still support this country. But combating it isn't done by Ukraine putting out anti-propaganda. Combating it is by British and American governments making it illegal for Russians to spread misinformation into our televisions. That is the way this is stopped. It's easily done. We had the Tenet media scandal 2 years ago, where $11 million was given to the CEO of an organization for lots of right-wingers to spread Russian talking points. That was discovered by the government and it was shut down. We can shut down these networks, but it's just about taking the Russian threat seriously enough and dedicating resources to stopping it. I would put all the resources of MI5 into this if I was the head of the UK government. One of the former heads of Reform, which is a major political party in the UK, has just been involved in a trial for taking money from the Kremlin and spreading it. This is a major political party. This is today. I don't know if you saw this.
No.
So Reform UK is one of the biggest political parties now. It's taken over the Conservatives in popularity. Nigel Farage has obviously had interesting connections with Russia, as all we'll say. Yeah. But one of the key politicians has been found taking Kremlin cash. That should be illegal. That should be something that is arrestable. You should go to prison for it. And if we start taking the Russian threat seriously enough in Britain, then this ends immediately. But we've got politicians, media personalities. The Lebedevs bought the London Evening Standard. We allow Russia to buy our newspapers, to buy our politicians. We give them knighthoods in the House of Lords, and we allow them to pollute our politics and allow them to pollute our media as if it's just a regular country. And until that stops, the propaganda is going to keep spreading, but it can be stopped overnight. the government just needs to wake up and realize that it's a hostile nation that's still at war with us. Russians have poisoned people on British soil in Salisbury. They have flown drones into NATO literally a month ago. They flew a fighter jet over Estonia literally 2 weeks ago. They're at war with NATO, yet we allow them to buy our newspapers and buy our televisions. This is unhinged behavior, and until that's stopped, then we're still going to see this repeat and repeat and repeat. Because we allow them to. If you give Russia an inch, they'll take a mile, and we allow them to pollute our politics.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to follow up, I have read a very interesting article about how weak Europe is now and how they cannot resist Russian aggression. And just a quote from here: Europe, the continent that gave the world democracy, the Renaissance, the great explorers, the liberation ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the emancipation of slavery, is now the world's laughing stock.
Absolutely. It is, because we've allowed ourselves to become weak to what the threat against us all is. We are the ones that opened the Nord Stream pipeline after Russia took Crimea. We're the ones that decided short-term cash was better than preserving our democracy and preserving our freedom. And it's so humiliating being from the rest of Europe, being even born into any of these countries that took part in this, because we allowed it to happen. We funded partially this war. The money that gets given to soldiers, a lot of that money comes from gas that's bought from Germany, from Hungary, from EU member states.
Yes.
And it's so sad and it's so weak. And I don't think these countries are going to realize the Russian threat until it's too late, until there are drones flying into Germany, until the sights that you and people in Ukraine have to see every single night, like at 5 o'clock this morning with missiles flying over your cities. I don't think people will seem to realize it until it's too late, until it really hits them, when survival kicks in. They're just sitting back and watching. But that's why Ukraine has basically taken things into their own hands. That's why they're now hitting Russia, because they're looking west and they're saying, what is going on here? You guys can't even decide if we're at war with Russia or not. You can't even decide which politician you're going to sell to Russia. We're going to start hitting Russia ourselves and taking it into our own hands, developing our own weapons, our own missiles, because they're not a proper ally. And I made a video about this when I was in London, talking about the Blitz. And you know, when Jinping and the leader of North Korea and Putin all gathered for that military parade in China, this is World War II, where you have an axis and you have no allies. This is as if you had Horenko, Mussolini and Hitler all gathered together for a military parade, and France and Britain still deciding if it's even a threat. This would be the same situation now. And appeasement can only be forgiven once. And we tried that in World War II. We tried appeasement. Neville Chamberlain tried it with Hitler. It didn't work. Hitler just took more. They carved up Poland the next day. That's what's happening now. And history won't appease appeasement. History won't forgive appeasement twice.
No way. I think they just put their own comfort, Europeans, over any kind of risks.
Short-term. It's short-term cash. It's short-term cash from the Kremlin. And in the 90s, when the first gas pipeline was being talked about being built from Russia to Germany, yes, the American government actually came in and said, this is a disaster. You shouldn't be doing this. A, we want to sell you the gas instead from Alaska. But B, if you do this, you will be at the receiving end of an energy war with Russia, and Russia will start having sway and pull over your countries. This will be bad for your democracy. This will be bad for your freedom. And it was the Americans that tried to stop it happening. But they decided on the short-term money. They decided to build it instead. And the Russians offered 2 years of free gas for building that. They said, we'll give you 2 years free. And then all the politicians made money from it. Some of the lobbyists that helped push it are now in Russia, the German lobbyists. So we chose quick cash, short-term, over our own security. And now the consequences are coming in, because in 2014, when Estonia protested about what happened in Crimea, the Estonian oil prices doubled as a punishment. This was predicted for so long. We saw it coming, and now this is the result of it. And that's why I'm glad that they're blowing up these gas pipelines, because this is what's paying for all this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if we won't shut off the taps, then Ukraine's going to shut off the taps.
Caolan, it's always a pleasure to listen to you, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.